The tide had gone out in the dark, and Selina walked the Staithe at the ebb, counting what was left to her on her fingers, which was nothing. It was an hour before any light. The creek lay below the timber edge of the Staithe in a long grey ribbon of mud. The water pulled back to a thread that caught no shine at all, and the marsh ran out flat and black on either side toward a sea she could only hear. Frost had come in the night. It stood white on the coiled rope and on the worn heads of the bollards, and her breath went out of her in slow pale clouds, and was taken sideways by the wind off the water. She had pinned her widow's veil up out of her face to walk, and the cold found her cheek and held it. She had begun the sum at the cottage door, and she finished it now at the footbridge. The little brick-arched bridge stood over the narrowest reach of the creek, where she could lay a gloved hand on the frost-furred rail and look down at the slack tide. £40 owed to the chandler at Wells, 11 to the man who had carted the coal, a doctor's bill she would not name aloud even to the dark. Against it she set the contents of a strong-box that held only more paper of the same kind, and a cottage she did not own, and a black gown rubbed grey at the elbow. The columns would not be made to balance however she ruled them. She had a good head for figures, and the figures told her the truth. And the truth was that there was nothing. The dog came up out of the saltings to lean against her skirt. He was a long grey-muzzled lurcher, brindle, with a white shirt front gone dim with age, and he had kept the old captain's cottage before he had kept her, and now he kept her because there was no one else to keep. Pilot. She put her hand down into the warm rough coat of his neck and left it there, and the two of them stood on the bridge, while the dark thinned by degrees over the water, and the first gulls woke and complained somewhere out on the bar. Under her bodice, on a worn cord that had frayed to softness against her skin, hung a single button. It was a ship's bell button, cut from a dead man's coat, and it lay cold against her now, as everything lay cold, and she did not put her hand to it, because she had taught herself not to. When there was light enough to see the path, she walked back along the Staithe toward the town. The little notebook was in her reticule with its stub of pencil, the figures all ruled and totted in her own fast, neat hand, and she did not take it out, because she had done the sum, and the sum was finished. In the square at Wells a man was up early at the church board, with a pot of paste and a roll of bills. She did not need to read it from across the cold square. She had known for a week that it must come, but she crossed to it and stood, and read it through once, plainly, the way she read everything, while the paste went grey and tacky in the frost. The whole estate of the late Lord Wraxham, the bill said, the contents of Wraxham Hall entire, the furniture and the plate and the books and the pictures, the linen, the wine, the late captain's sea chest and instruments, to be sold by auction on the premises, on a day in November, by direction of the family. There was a deal of fine large type about the quality of the lots. At the foot, smaller, the name of the family's man of business, Mr. Hartlequennell, and a line to say that the proceeds were applied to the discharge of the estate's encumbrances. The discharge of the estate's encumbrances. She knew that phrase. It meant the debts were to be paid off the backs of the dead, and the family made clean, and the last of them that anyone need not look at, herself, swept out with the rest of the lots into someone else's wagon. She read it once, and turned from it and did not let her face do anything at all, because a man was watching her from the inn door to see if the widow would weep, and she would not give him that. She walked home along the creek with the dog. The water had begun, far out, to turn. That was all the marsh gave her that morning. The first faint push of the flood somewhere beyond the bar, the long grey thread beginning, very slowly, to thicken. It had been at the flood that she met him, 4 summers gone, on this same bridge. She came back to it now the way one comes back to a warm room out of the cold, not meaning to, simply finding herself there. In that other August, the creek had run full and bright to the very lip of the Staithe, brimming silver, with the sun hot on the tide and the marsh behind it, a haze of sea lavender gone purple to the dunes. She had been 22, and her father's daughter, the shipwright's clever girl from the yard at the head of the creek, sent up to the town with Varol's sea charts under her arm, because she could be trusted with them, and her father's apprentice could not. Her sleeves had been pushed back. Her hair had come down at the nape in the heat, and she had not cared. The roll slipped on the crown of the bridge. A chart came loose and went skating along the planks toward the water, and a man's boot came down on it and stopped it at the very edge. He bent and picked it up, and when he straightened and gave it back to her, he had already looked at it, the way she would have looked at it. He had it the right way round, his thumb on the soundings, his eye going down the line of the channel and the figures of the depths at the ebb, reading it, not merely holding it. He was perhaps 26 then, tall, dark, weathered brown about the face from his own years before the mast, in a plain coat with the salt still on it. The captain's elder son. She knew the family the way everyone at Wells knew the family, as a name on the heath above them. She had not known the face. "You've the Barsh shoaling here," he said, with his thumb on it, as if they had been talking an hour. "Since the last survey, there's a foot less water on the ebb than your chart owns to." "There's 1.5 feet less," she said, "and it walks east a little every winter. My father has it in his book. He is not troubled to have it engraved, because no one buys a chart of Wells but the men who already know the bar by heart." He looked at her then properly, and she watched the thing happen in his face that she had felt happen in her own. A quick resorting, a setting down of the picture he had begun to make, of a girl with a roll of paper, and the taking up of a different one. It was not gallant, and it was not warm exactly. It was recognition. Two people who counted things meeting over a thing that wanted counting, and each finding the other quick. They stood on the bridge a long while in the brimming light. He asked her how the yard set a futtock, and whether her father caulked with oakum or with the new stuff, and she told him, and asked him in turn, what the holding was like off the Texel, and whether it was true the Dutch pilots would not come out under a certain glass, and he told her that. He had a way of answering that gave her the whole of a thing, and none of the flourish, as though he respected her too much to dress an account up, and she found she was answering him the same, plain figure for plain figure, with the queer light feeling of a woman who has carried a closed box a long way, and been told at last she may set it down. No one at the yard talked to her so. The men were kind and called her a clever girl, and meant by it that she was a curiosity. He did not seem to find her a curiosity at all. He found her, she understood with a small shock, an equal, and was neither alarmed by it nor minded to make her a compliment of it, which was itself the truest compliment she had ever had. The tide came up under them to the full and stood, the way it does, a hush of high water with the marsh all silver, and neither of them marked it going down again. When she went home at last, the chart was creased where his boot had stopped it, and she did not smooth the crease out. She kept it folded so for a long time, that one crease, until she had no charts of her own to keep at all. He came down to the yard after that, on errands that did not need him. She found work at the Staithe on mornings she might have done at home. It was a summer of the flood, that one, everything full and bright and brimming to the lip, and seeming as if it must always be so. They were not children. They both knew what the name on the heath meant, and what the gate of the yard meant, and that between the two there ran a thing harder to dredge than any bar. But for the length of one high summer they let the tide be at the full, and did not look at the figures, the only time in her life she had ever let a sum go unfinished and been glad. It ended as such things end, without much being said, by the people whose business it was to end it. The captain's elder son was the heir. There had been a title coming a long way off, through a thin line of cousins, and a name, and an estate of mortgages, that the name was meant to mend by a good marriage. And a shipwright's daughter, the creek, however quick, however straight in the back, was not the mending the family had in view. Selina was never told this in those words. She was told nothing in any words at all. That was how it was done. What was done was this: he was wanted at sea. There was always a ship that wanted a Marwood, and he was got there quickly, before the autumn, with the family's blessing ringing in his ears like a thing shut behind him. And she, who must not be left loose about the creek to be a temptation and an embarrassment, was settled. The family's second son, the younger, a quiet, weak-chested young man with his father's mild eyes and none of his father's iron. A man who did as he was bid and married where he was told, and it was thought a tidy arrangement on every side. The dangerous, clever girl bound into the family, where she could be watched and managed, and the younger son provided with a wife who could keep his accounts. They put it to her as a kindness, and as a kindness she could not in conscience refuse it, for her father's yard was failing by then, and a Marwood connection would carry it another year. She married the younger brother in the grey of a November morning much like this one, in the squat round-towered church on the marsh, with the wind off the sea coming under the door. There were few people. The old captain came and stood, and afterward took her hand in both his big scarred ones, and looked at her a moment too long, as if he knew exactly the shape of the thing that had been done, and could not undo it, and was sorry. The bridegroom was kind to her, in his weak mild way, all the years they had. She had no complaint of him to make to anyone, then or after. She had only never once been glad of the flood with him, and she had taught herself not to think of bridges. The elder brother was at sea, off the Texel perhaps, where the Dutch pilots would not come out under a certain glass. He did not write. There was nothing for him to write. That was 4 years gone, and now they were all of them dead but her, or as good as gone. The younger son had died first at sea, 2 winters past, on a voyage he had had no business making in a season no prudent owner would have sailed. She had not understood at the time why he went. He was no sailor, and frightened of the water, and had clung to the land all his married life. He had gone white and silent for a fortnight before he shipped, and had not told her why, and had kissed her hand on the stayth in the rain, in a way that frightened her, and the vessel was lost on the Dogger, with all hands in the first gale of December. He left her his name, which was a Marwood name, and worth nothing to anyone, and a strong box of his debts, which were worth a great deal of misery, and the ship's bell button off his good coat, which she had cut free with her own scissors before they took the coat to be sold, and had worn ever, since on a cord under her bodice, not for love exactly. She would not lie to herself about love, but because someone ought to keep something of a man who had been kind to her in a small way and frightened to death in a large one. And the old captain had died this autumn, at 68, upright in his chair, by the cottage hearth with the dog at his feet. He was the last Marwood who had ever dealt fairly with her, and he had left her the only inheritance she had ever truly wanted, though it was worth nothing in money: his books. For he had been a merchant captain 40 years, and an honest one, which is rarer than an honest anything ashore, and he had kept his accounts the way other men keep their souls. He had a brass-bound sea chest and a row of dated logbooks and a great worn ships, ledger ruled in his own slow careful hand, every freight and every wage and every cask of every cargo totted and signed, and a small brass strong-box with a key, And when his own son's family had begun, these last years, to keep a different sort of book. A soft book, a book of things said in the right ears until they hardened into county fact. The old man had gone on quietly keeping his true one, and had taught the only person near him who could read it. He had taught her at the chart table by one candle, the winter after her marriage, the same way he might have taught a clerk. He showed her how a false account always carries its own contradiction in it, if you have the patience to find where the column does not close. He made her rule and tot, until her figures were as fast and fair as his own. And he told her the things she had carried since, like the button under her bodice. In the flat, far-sighted way, he said everything that mattered, that the sea keeps no secret a careful book cannot recover, and that a woman who can read a true account is never quite at the mercy of the men who keep a false one. She had thought it only kindness, an old man giving a lonely young woman something to do with good, clever head in a house that had no use for it. She understood now that it had been more. He had been leaving her a weapon and calling it a lesson, because he could not say in words, while he lived, what he could let her find in his book after he was dead. The great lady came to the cottage on the Tuesday, 2 days after the bill went up. Selina heard the carriage on the lane and had time to be ready. She put down her veil. She had learned the use of the veil, which was that behind it a face could be as still as it liked, and no one the wiser. And she set the room in order, which took no time, for the room had little in it now to disorder. A sloped table, 2 chairs, the brass-bound chest in the corner, with the captain's books, 1 candle not yet lit, and the small dark oval portrait of the old man over the hearth, half turned at his chart table, with one scarred hand flat on an open ledger. The dog got up and stood by her skirt and watched the door. Mrs. Penhallow came in bringing the cold with her, and a great deal of soft grey silk, and stood and looked about the little room once, gracious, taking its measure before she would sit. She was tall and very erect, the iron grey hair dressed high and exact under a costly lace cap, the long, handsome face arranged in the smile that confers a favour. At her waist a little chain of keys and seals chimed faintly when she moved. She was the late lord's sister and the family's conscience, and she had decided, long ago and in front of everyone, exactly who Selina was, and she had said it often enough, and in the right ears, that it had set like a tide line in the mud, and become the shape of the county's belief. "My dear Selina," she said, and sat and arranged the grey silk, "you will not have me stand on ceremony at such a time. I came myself, you see, rather than send. One owes that much, whatever has passed." "You are very good," Selina said from behind the veil, and sat also, and put her hands quiet in her lap, and gave the lady nothing to look at. It was done graciously, and it took perhaps a quarter of an hour, and it was the cruelest thing that had been said to her in 4 years. The lady was sorry, she said, deeply sorry for the whole sad business. No one wished to be unkind, but Selina must see how it stood. The estate was to be sold, and the debts discharged, and the family, after these unhappy years, set in order at last. It was best for everyone. It was best, the lady said with the smallest pause, even for Selina herself, who could surely have no wish to remain in a county where— here the smile held quite still, where so much was so generally understood. There was a connection in Lynn, the lady believed, who might take a respectable widow as a companion, a fresh place, a kindness to all parties. The Marwoods would not see her quite destitute. That was not their way. But she would understand that her presence at the sale, for instance, at Wraxham, among the family in the county, would be felt by everyone to be in the worst possible taste, and the lady was confident that a woman of Selina's good sense would not dream of it. Under it all, never once said and present in every word, ran the thing that had hardened into fact. that Selina was a nobody who had married a Marwood for the name, and had been cold to the poor weak husband she had snared, and had driven him in his misery to the sea and to his death, that she was a schemer who had got nothing she did not deserve to lose, and that the whole county knew it, and that this was therefore not the lady's opinion, but simply the truth, against which a veiled black figure in a cold cottage could have nothing whatever to say. Selina said nothing whatever. She let the lady finish, and rise and draw the grey shawl about her, and pause at the door to say that she was glad they understood one another, and to say it warmly, as though kindness had been done and received. The little keys chimed. The carriage went away down the lane. The dog lay down again. She did not light the candle for a long while. She sat in the failing afternoon with her hands in her lap, and let herself, for once, feel the whole weight of it, not the money. The money she had measured already, but the other thing, the lie worn so smooth by use that it had stopped being a lie and become merely the air she breathed in this county, the thing every gracious smile rested on, the thing that would follow her to Lynn and to anywhere, and put her down at last in some other woman's chimney corner as a thing that had once been respectable and had spoiled. Her husband driven to his death. She had not driven him anywhere. She did not yet know what had, but she knew the shape of a man going white and silent for a fortnight and kissing a hand in the rain, and it was not the shape of a man fleeing a cold wife. It was the shape of a man fleeing something he could not pay. When it was full dark, she lit the one candle and went to the chest in the corner and took out the captain's great ledger and laid it on the sloped table and opened it. She did not read it idly. She read it the way the old man had taught her, going down the columns with the candle close, looking not for what was there, but for where a column would not close. She knew the years she wanted. She found the place where the family's soft book and the captain's true one must touch. The season before the younger son shipped on the voyage that drowned him, and she ran a finger down the captain's slow fair hand, freight and wage and cask, all of it closing, all of it square, until it did not. There was an entry. It was dated, and it was in the old man's own hand, and it was witnessed, and it concerned a sum of money. A loan called in suddenly and cruelly against the younger son, a debt of the family's own making, pressed home at a date she could set against the date the young man went white and silent, by a hand whose name was written there plain in the captain's careful letters. And below it, in the same hand, a second entry, smaller, that her own breath caught on. A record of payments made against that ruin quietly, over 2 years, in small honest sums by S.M. Paid down. The old man had written, by his son's wife out of her own economy and told to none. She had not known he knew, she had told no one. She had sold her own few things, and gone without coal, and paid what she could against her husband's secret terror, because it was owed and because someone honest had to, and the old man had seen it and set it down in his true book in his own hand, against the day a careful reader should need it. She sat a long time with the ledger open under the one candle and the dog's chin come to rest on her foot. Outside, very far off across the dark marsh, she could hear the creek beginning on the turn to fill. The flood was coming back up the channel in the dark the way it always did, patient and certain, whatever anyone on the shore believed. She put her black-gloved hand flat on the open page, where his hand and hers were written together, the way the old man held his in the portrait, and she let herself understand what she was going to do. She would not go to Lynn. She would not be a companion in another woman's chimney corner. The captain's chest and his books and the brass strongbox were to be sold among the lots at Wraxham, sold and scattered, and the proof in them lost forever in some buyer's lumber room. Unless someone bought them back. She had no money. But she had a veil that made a face still, and a black-gloved hand that could be raised. and a head for figures that no one in that firelit hall would think to fear in a quiet, unknown widow at the back of the room. She closed the ledger gently and sat with her hand on its worn brass-bound cover. On the day of the sale she would go up onto the heath to Wraxham Hall, veiled and unknown, and she would bid. They had opened the whole length of the great hall to the cold, and still it was too warm. 2 hearths the size of cart beds burned at either end, and a brass chandelier had been lowered on its chain and filled and hauled up again, so that it swung a slow ring of gold across the oak overhead. Branched stands of candles stood ranked down the room like a regiment, and the light of them doubled itself in the old glass of the mullioned windows, and in the dark family portraits, and in the rubbed gilt of 100 frames carried in for the sale. The county had come up from the marsh and down from the heath in their carriages, and the cold had come with them, and between the cold at their backs and the fires at their faces, they stood flushed and bright, and a little drunk on the spectacle of a great house, turned out into lots. It was, Crispin thought, exactly like watching gulls work a drowned thing on the tide line, and being the one who had spread the table. He stood at the head of the room. Behind the clerk's high desk they had carried up from the estate office and set on a dais and called, for the day, the rostrum. He had refused a hired auctioneer. It had seemed to him, in the grey weeks of arranging it, that if the thing must be done, then he would do it himself, and not pay a stranger to be cheerful over his father's chairs. Now, with the catalogue under his hand, and the room filling, and the patter not yet begun, he understood that he had only chosen the harder way to be cruel, and that the choosing of it had been pride, and that pride was about the only inheritance the family had not yet been obliged to sell. To his right, a half step down off the dais, and a careful arm's length from the candles, sat Mr. Quennell with a green-taped bundle of deeds across his knees, and another at his feet, grey as a winter dyke and just as unmoved by weather. The attorney had set out the lots himself that morning, going down the catalogue in his dry voice, and he had set out the books of the rostrum table with the same care, and he had said nothing whatever about the 3 objects he had placed at Crispin's left hand among the gavel and the candle and the marked-up catalogue. Crispin had assumed they were lots like any other, waiting their turn. They did not look like the rest. Everything else in the room had been polished for selling. These 3 had only been brought up out of a cold place and set down. A ship's ledger, brass-bound at the corners and worn pale along the spine, lying open at a page someone had marked with a strip of folded paper. A single old letter, much creased, its red wax seal broken across and then, plainly, pressed back together, so that the break in it ran like a healed scar through the device, and a small brass strong-box, no bigger than a bread loaf, with a key standing in its lock. He had glanced at them twice while the room filled, and twice looked away. They were his father's. He knew the ledger by the green-brown stain on the backboard, where the old man had once set a wet log glass down on it in a gale and never been forgiven by his own sense of order. He did not want to look at it. He did not, if he was honest, want to look at any of it, and had spent a year learning not to want things he could not have, and was very tired. Down the room, near the 3rd window, Miss Frederica Vane stood between her aunt and a great deal of expensive lace, and looked as though she would rather be anywhere on the salt earth than here. She caught his eye once and produced a smile that cost her so visibly that he was ashamed of having drawn it out of her. She was a kind girl. The arrangement that had her standing there, fair and frightened and waiting to be married into a ruin, was no more her doing than his, and they both knew it, and neither of them had yet found the courage to say the obvious thing aloud to anyone with the power to undo it. Closer to the rostrum, very erect, in dove-grey silk that caught the candlelight like the inside of a shell, stood the great lady. his father's sister. She had taken up a position from which she could be seen to preside without appearing to, and the little chatelaine of keys and seals at her waist chimed faintly when she turned to acknowledge an arrival, which she did with the precise lift of the chin that conferred her notice, and the precise withdrawal of it that ended the favour. She was, he understood, enjoying herself, in the grave and gracious way she enjoyed all the occasions on which the family's dignity was on show, and she had arranged her face to suggest that the selling of her brother's house was a sad necessity nobly borne, which was nearly the only true thing about her this morning. Quennell touched the catalogue. "They are settled, my lord. You may begin when you choose." Crispin took up the gavel and did not for a moment choose anything. Then he brought it down once lightly, and the room turned to him like a field of barley turning under wind, and the patter began, and he heard his own voice doing it well, which disgusted him. The early lots went briskly. A pair of japanned cabinets, a lot of Sèvres with a hairline through the best plate, the long case clock from the stair hall that had told the time wrong his whole boyhood. He learned the rhythm of it within the first quarter hour, the way the bids came up in little waves and broke, the dealers from Norwich working in pairs along the side wall, the gentry bidding for things they did not need against neighbours they did not like. He kept the patter level and the gavel honest and tried to feel nothing, as the rooms of the house went off one by one into other people's gigs. He did not see the woman come in. Afterwards he could not have said when she had taken her place, only that at some point between the clock and the library he had become aware of a stillness at the very back of the room, near the screen of carved oak where the candlelight thinned and the cold from the door reached, and that the stillness had a shape, and the shape was a woman in deep black, standing entirely alone. She had not come to buy chairs. He knew that the way he knew weather. Everyone else in the room leaned and craned and consulted their catalogues and whispered. She stood with her hands quiet before her and her chin level, and a long black veil dropped clean over her whole face, and she watched. She did not look at the things. She looked at the table beside his hand, where the three plain objects sat among the candle and the gavel, and then she looked at him, or at where his voice was. Through the veil he could not tell. A widow then, and not of the county, for he knew the county widows and their veils were a half measure, worn high off the face. This one had dropped hers entire, and meant not to be seen, and the meaning to not be seen was itself a thing that drew the eye, and he made himself look back at the catalogue. Lot 41, he said, the contents of the late captain's sea chest, as catalogued, his charts, his instruments, his logbooks and accounts, the chest itself, and Quennell's dry finger had moved a half-inch on the page, and Crispin understood, with a small cold drop of the stomach, what the finger meant. And the brass-bound ledger and strong-box here upon the table, taken together as one lot. So they had been entered after all. He had not known. Someone had bound the honest things in with the chest the night before, and set a number against them, and the someone was not Quennell, who would have told him, and was not himself. He looked once, very quickly, toward the dove-grey silk, and the great lady was looking at the catalogue with the serene attention of a woman who has arranged that a thing be done, and is now waiting to watch it be done. The captain's whole reckoning, his books and his bound accounts, the work of 40 honest years, was to be knocked down for whatever a dealer would give for old paper and brass, and carried out of the house, and lost in some warehouse in Lynn or Norwich. And that, he saw now, was the entire purpose of bringing it up to the room at all. He had been made the instrument of it without being told. He had spent a year being made the instrument of things without being told. "What am I bid?" he said, and his own voice sounded to him as though it came from across the marsh. for the late captain's chest and his books and accounts entire. A Norwich dealer near the wall, scenting nothing in it but weight of old vellum, raised 2 fingers, 10 shillings. 10 shillings is bid, and at the back of the room, by the cold screen, a black-gloved hand went up. It went up without haste and without any of the small flourish the gentry used. It simply rose, level, to the height of her shoulder, and stayed there a moment until he saw it, and came down. He had seen 10,000 hands raised in his life, and never one that asked for so little. Notice while taking so much. "The lady bids," he said. "Ma'am, a guinea." The voice came low and quite clear from under the veil, carrying down the hushed room without being raised at all. A level alto with the flat, clean vowels of the coast under the schooling, and it went through Crispin like cold water down the spine, and he did not know why. A guinea is bid. He had lost the rhythm of his own patter for a half-beat and recovered it. "A guinea against you, sir." The dealer, surprised to be opposed over a chest of old logbooks, came back at her, and she let him have his bid and then went over it, and the 2 of them climbed it together, up past 2 guineas and past 3, while the room began, slowly, to attend. There was a smell of sport in it now. A dealer and a strange veiled widow contending in earnest over a worthless lot was the kind of thing the county had come up the heath to see. And they turned in their places and watched her hand go up, and watched the dealer scowl. And somewhere a man laughed, low, and was hushed. She did not hurry and she did not hesitate. Her bids came on the beat, exact. Never a shilling more than was wanted to clear the last, and Crispin found himself listening for the voice, the way a man at the masthead listens into fog for the bell he knows must come, and could not place it, and could not let it go. There was something in the set of her, under the black, the very straightness of her, the economy of that lifted hand, the way she gave a figure as though she had ruled it in a column and totted it, and knew to the penny what it would cost her, and was prepared to spend exactly that, and not 1 farthing past it. He had known a woman who reckoned like that. He had not let himself think of her in daylight for a long time, and he did not let himself now, except that the not-letting was suddenly a labour, here in his father's hall, with the candles swinging their slow ring of gold, and the cold reaching up the room from the door she had come in by. The dealer fell away at 4 guineas with a shake of the head, and Crispin thought it was done, and was already lifting the gavel, when one of the family's own buyers came in. He knew the man. A close-mouthed agent the great lady used, who had bid all morning on the better lots and bid. Crispin had assumed, on the family's account, to hold the prices up where a friend or a creditor wished them held. The agent had not bid on a chest of old logbooks all morning. He bid on it now, sharp, jumping the lady's 4 guineas to 6, and Crispin understood the rest of it in one clean, unpleasant moment. It was not enough to sell the captain's books away cheap to a stranger. The unknown widow was running them up, and the widow must not have them, and so the family's own man would buy them in at any price sooner than let her, and the books would go up into the locked press in the estate office and never come out. And that, and not 10 shillings of vellum, was what was being defended in this room. 6 guineas, he said, and could not keep something out of his voice, and saw Quesnel's pale eye move to him and away. 7 is bid. He turned to the agent. Sir, 8. The man did not look at her. He looked at the dove-grey silk, once, the way a servant looks for an instruction, and got it in the smallest possible inclination of an iron-grey head, and bid again before he was asked. 10. A murmur went round. 10 guineas for a chest of a dead sailor's papers was past sport now and into mystery, and the room loved it, and the great lady's gracious smile held its shape with a fixed and shining steadiness that Crispin, who had spent a year learning her, recognized as the smile she wore when something's not going, as she had arranged, and she had decided that no one should see it. He looked down the room to the screen. The veiled woman had not moved at all. The cold black shape of her stood as straight as a mast, and the lifted hand had come down, and for a moment he thought the family had carried it, that the agent had frightened her off, that she would let the books go into the dark press and turn and walk out into the marsh, and the relief and the disappointment he felt at the thought was so disproportionate to a chest of logbooks that he was alarmed at himself. Then the hand rose again, unhurried, to the height of her shoulder. 15 guineas, said the voice. It dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the rings of it went out, and the whole hall fell silent. And into the silence, the cold from the door, came up the floor and touched the candles, so that the long ranks of flame bowed all together and stood up. 15 guineas. For old paper, it was an absurdity, and it was a declaration. And everyone in the room heard it as a declaration, without knowing of what, and turned from the woman to Crispin and back, waiting. He should have called for the agent's answer. He found he had set the gavel down. "That is a great deal, ma'am," he heard himself say, and it was not patter. It was a man speaking to a woman across a room, low, almost gentle, and the room heard that too, and the great lady's smile fixed itself another degree. "A great deal for old books and a brass box. They are worth nothing to anyone but the family." There was a silence the length of a slow heartbeat. The black veil lifted a very little as she raised her head to find his voice. "They are worth," she said, "to me exactly what I have bid for them. I do not bid past the worth of a thing I never have." A pause, the smallest possible, and then, level and clear and meant, "Your father taught me that, my lord. The sea keeps no secret a careful book cannot recover." The hall did not understand it. The hall heard only a strange widow being impertinent over a chest of papers, and a little ripple of scandalized pleasure ran along the side wall. But Crispin stood at the head of his father's ruined house, with the gavel out of his hand and the candlelight swinging gold across the oak, and he felt the floor of the last 4 years tilt slowly under him. Because he had heard those words in that voice before, on a bright stave over a dropped chart, with the tide at the flood, and his whole life still in front of him, and he had spent a great deal of effort, persuading himself that the woman who had said them was lost to him past recovering, married into another room of his own family, and then widowed and gone away into a black he need never look at. And the woman who had just said them again was standing at the back of his hall, with a veil over her face, 15 guineas deep into a fight for his dead father's books, and he could not see her face, and he could not breathe quite right, and he did not, would not, dared not say the name that had come up into his mouth like the tide. "Sir," said Quesnel quietly, at his elbow, and Crispin came back into the room, and found the agent waiting, and the great lady waiting, and 100 candlelit faces waiting, on a gavel he had forgotten he was holding. 15 guineas is bid, he said. His voice was not entirely his own. "Against you, sir." The agent looked to the dove-grey silk for his instruction, and for the first time all morning the instruction did not come at once. The great lady's eyes had gone from the veiled woman to her nephew's face and stopped there, and Crispin saw her read what was in it. He could not have hidden it. He had not had a year's practice at hiding this particular thing, and he saw the gracious smile lose all at once its shine and go still. It was not yet fear. It was the stillness of a woman who has built a thing very carefully over a long time, and has just felt, far down, the first give in the ground under it. Near the third window, Frederica Vane was watching him too. She had followed his face from the veiled stranger to the bid and back, and her round, soft, anxious face had gone through surprise into something quieter and, Crispin saw with a pang of shame for her and for himself, something very like relief. She had understood kind, frightened girl. More quickly than the cleverest dealer in the room, the only thing that mattered about the morning, that the man she was to be married to, was looking at a woman in black, at the back of the hall, the way no arrangement on earth could make a man look, and that whatever else came of the day, she herself had just been quietly and mercifully set free of him, and was glad. The great lady recovered first. She turned from her nephew's face with the deliberate grace of long command, and she inclined her iron-grey head to the agent, and the agent. 20 guineas. 20 is bid. Crispin put the figure to the back of the room, and was answered before the words were cold. 25. 30, said the agent, flat, on the great lady's nod. And there was an ugliness in it now that the room had begun to feel without naming, the ugliness of a powerful house spending, without limit, to keep a single woman from a thing she wanted, and the pleasure went out of the watching faces, and a kind of unease came into them instead. The veiled woman stood very still under the slow gold ring of the chandelier. When her hand rose again, it rose more slowly, and Crispin, who could read a column of figures as well as any clerk in the county, and had spent the morning watching her bid, exactly to the penny, and never passed it, understood that she was near the top of what she had ruled in her notebook, that the family, with its bottomless need to win, could go past her, that the strong box and the books were about to be carried up into the dark of the locked press in front of her, bought in over her head with money the estate did not have, to keep them out of her hands forever, and that she knew it. 35 guineas, she said, and there was, for the first time, the faintest unevenness under the level of it, a thing only a man listening as Crispin was listening could have caught, and it went into him like a hook. 35 is bid, he said, and turned to the agent and prayed dishonestly against his own family's victory. The agent looked to the great lady, and the great lady did not nod. She had been watching the room turn, the unease along the side wall, the way the county's pleasure had curdled, the look on her nephew's face that she could not now mistake. And she made, in the space of 2 breaths, a different calculation, and Crispin watched her make it. To go on bidding was to win the lot and lose the room, to be seen plainly, to be ruining the estate, to crush an unknown widow over a chest of worthless papers. Before the whole county she had spent her life commanding. There was a cleaner way. There was always with her a cleaner way. She did not bid. She turned instead, with a soft chime of the little keys at her waist, and bent her head to Mr. Quesnel, and said something to him low and brief and pleasant, and Crispin watched the dry grey attorney's careful, neutral face take the instruction and give nothing back. Then she straightened, and folded her gloved hands and waited, gracious again, the smile restored to a careful warmth, as though she had merely thought better of an extravagance, and would now let a sad old chest go cheaply to a foolish woman who wanted it. Quesnel rose. He came up the half-step to the rostrum, the green tape of a deed bundle still threaded through his fingers, and he leaned to Crispin's ear, and he spoke so quietly that not even the front rank could hear, in the flat, dry voice of a man reading a clause he has been ordered to read and does not love. My lord, Mrs. Penhallow instructs me to inform you that Lot 41 is withdrawn from the sale. The captain's books and accounts, the ledger, and the strong box are to be retained in the family's own keeping, and entered upon no catalogue. She regrets the confusion. The lady at the rear of the room is bidding upon property that is no longer for sale. A small pause. The pale, shrewd eyes came up to Crispin's, neutral, unreadable, and went down again. If the lady should object, the attorney said, lower still. Mrs. Penhallow is of a mind that an unknown person creating a disturbance at a private sale may properly be asked to withdraw. The decision, my lord, is yours to announce. And there it was, laid on the rostrum table beside the gavel, as plainly as the three honest objects themselves. The family had felt the threat in her, without knowing its name, had seen a strange black-veiled woman drive the price of the captain's worthless old books to 35 guineas as though they were worth a kingdom, and had reasoned, correctly, that no one fights so hard and so exactly for old paper unless the paper says something, and so the paper would not be sold at all. It would be lifted out of the room entire, withdrawn, locked into the press in the cold estate office, kept. The ledger he could see open at its marked page from where he stood, the letter with its broken and mended seal, the brass box with the key still standing in it. All of it about to be carried out of the candlelight and into a dark from which it would not come, again lawfully quietly, with no voice raised at all, by the simple mercantile act of declaring it not for sale. He looked down the long warm room to the cold screen at the back, where the woman in black stood very straight and very still, and had heard nothing of what the attorney had said, and waited, with her hand half lowered and 35 guineas of her hidden figures on the table, for a bid that was never going to be asked of the family again. Because the thing she had come the whole way across the marsh in her widow's black to buy, the only proof she had, was being taken off the table in front of her, and in a moment he would have to be the one to say so aloud, and she would have, then, exactly one way left to stop it. There was a moment, very small, in which she could still have stayed hidden. Quesnel had set down his pen. Crispin had given the nod that withdrew the lot. The captain's sea chest, the row of logbooks, the worn ledger inside them. And a clerk was already lifting the brass-bound box from the table to carry it away into some back room where the gavel would never reach it. The great lady stood at the lord's elbow, with her gracious smile fixed bright as a lamp turned up too high. Watching the proof Selina had come for walk out of the firelight on a servant's 2 hands, Selina could have let it go. She could have kept the veil down over her face, and her name to herself, sat very still at the back of the crowded hall among strangers, and lost the only thing in the room that told the truth. No one would have known the shipwright's daughter had been there at all. She had spent 4 years learning to take up little room and miss nothing, and the habit of it pulled at her now like a hand on her sleeve. Stay covered, stay safe, stay nobody. She stood instead, the bench scraped. A dozen faces near her turned at the small ill-bred sound, the way faces turn at a sale when something is about to be had cheap. She lifted her chin under the crape, and the few heads became a great many, and across all that warm and shifting light she found the high clerk's table and the man behind it, and she reached up with both black-gloved hands and threw the veil back from her face. The hall did not gasp. It went quiet, which was worse. Quiet the way the marsh goes quiet at the turn of the tide, when the water stops running one way and has not yet decided to run the other. 200 candles, and the brass chandelier, and the 2 great hearths threw their light full on her pale uncovered face, on the dark chestnut hair pinned low, and the steady grey eyes and the high colour climbing one cheekbone, and she let them all look. She had nothing left to be ashamed of, and everything to be afraid of, and she had learned long ago that the two were not the same thing. Crispin half rose from the auctioneer's chair. She watched it happen across the whole length of the room, watched the grave courteous master of the sale, who had been a stranger to her all afternoon behind his table and his duty, go white to the lips in the space of a breath. His hand found the edge of the table and stayed there. The signet ring struck the wood once and was still. He did not say her name. He did not say anything at all. He only looked at her with his level dark blue eyes gone wide and stricken. The look of a man who has been shown a thing he buried with his own hands and finds it standing up alive. And through all the splendid lit room, there was nothing between them but the long cold distance, and 4 years, and his dead brother's name. She had not meant to feel it. She had meant to be a column of figures, ruled and told, come to claim what was owed. But the old pull came up out of the floor of her like the flood coming up the creek, quiet and entire, and for one moment she was not a widow in bombazine in a hall full of buyers. She was a girl on a footbridge in the sun, with a chart blowing loose in her hands, and a man laughing as he caught it. Then it passed, because it had to, and she stood again inside her blacks, with her hands quiet and her chin level, and waited for the room to do what rooms did to women like her. It was the great lady who broke the hush. Of course it was. "Why," said Mrs. Penhallow, and her voice carried beautifully, pitched to be heard at the back of the hall, without ever seeming to be raised, the voice of a woman who had held drawing rooms for 40 years. "Why, it is the younger Mrs. Marwood." She let the name fall among them like a coin tossed on a table, and Selina heard it picked up and turned over and passed along the benches in a low rustle. Come up from the coast in her blacks to bid on her own dead husband's family. How affecting. The fixed brightness of her smile did not waver. She had recovered the ground she lost in the first shock, as a swordswoman recovers her guard, and now she turned a little to take the room with her, the chatelaine of small keys and seals at her waist chiming faintly as she moved, a sound the whole county knew and trusted. "You must forgive her," she said to the nearest faces, confiding, gracious, terrible. "She is not, perhaps, quite well. Grief unsettles the judgment. But you will all remember the circumstance, I think." A small pause, exquisitely placed. "You remember how she came among us, a shipwright's girl off the Staithe at Wells, who set her cap at the name of Marwood, and would not be content until she had it, and married my poor younger nephew, who had not the strength to refuse her, and led him such a dance of debt and disappointment, that he took ship at last to be quit of her, and never came home." She turned the cold, light grey eyes back on Selina, and the graciousness went out of them like a lamp blown out. "She drove him to his death. The county knows it. And now she comes here, veiled like a thief, to pick over what is left, I think. Wraxham, to her nephew, not looking at him. She had better be put out." The room turned. Selina felt it turn against her, the way you feel the wind back round to the north, a cold settling certainty in 200 faces that had heard this story for 4 years over their tea, and believed it because a great lady had told it, and a great lady would not lie. She saw a stout man near the front fold his arms. She saw 2 women put their heads together. She saw Frederica Vane, the pretty frightened heiress in her expensive lace, standing a little apart with her round, soft face gone unhappy, looking not at Selina but at Crispin, and understanding something. And she saw Crispin himself, who had not yet moved or spoken, his weathered face caught between the white shock of recognition and a terrible dawning attention, his eyes going from Selina to the woman at his elbow and back again. Selina did not raise her voice. She had watched her father-in-law deal with hard men over a chart table all the years of her marriage, and she had learned from him that the man who shouts has already lost the figure he is arguing for. She let the rustle die. She let the great lady's words hang in the warm air and go a little stale. Then she spoke, low and exact, into the quiet, and because she was quiet the whole hall leaned to hear her. "Before the gavel falls," she said, "I should like one lot opened." Quennell, at his place beside the rostrum, went very still. He had his green-taped bundle of deeds under his arm, and his careful neutral face arranged for a long dull afternoon, but his pale shrewd eyes came up and fixed on her, and there was in them something that was not surprise. He had known, she thought. He had known the moment the captain's ledger came up on the table how the day must end, and he had been waiting, dry and grey as a winter dike, to see who would say the word. "This is irregular," said the great lady, and for the first time a thin thread of something tightened under the gracious voice. "Wraxham. Which lot?" said Crispin. It was the first thing he had said since the veil came back. His voice was not steady. She heard the unsteadiness in it, banked down hard, and she knew what it cost him to keep it level in front of the county. But he had asked her, and not the room, and not his aunt. He had turned his weathered face full to her, and asked her directly, as though there were no one else in the hall at all, and the asking was a small thing and an enormous one. "The sea chest," Selina said, "and what is in it? My father-in-law's ledger." She paused. Captain Tobias Marwood's own book, ruled and told in his own hand. "I should like it opened on the table, my lord, before the lot is sold or withdrawn and read." For a moment nobody moved. Then Crispin lifted one hand to the clerk, who stood arrested halfway to the door with the brass-bound box in his arms, and the clerk came back and set the box down on the auctioneer's table among the catalogue and the candle and the silent gavel. "Bring it here," Crispin said, and his eyes did not leave her. She came up the length of the hall to do it herself. She felt every face follow her, the slight straight-backed widow in her rubbed grey gloves, walking through the firelight between the ranks of benches, and she did not hurry, and she did not falter. Pilate, who had pressed against her hem at the back of the room, the grey-muzzled lurcher with the white chest who had kept the old captain's cottage and would not be parted from her, rose and came with her, his nails clicking on the oak floor, and she was glad of him at her knee. At the table she did not look at Crispin, because she could not yet and stay steady. She looked at the box. The sea chest had already been opened, and its contents laid out for the lot. The row of dated logbooks, the rolled charts, the brass dividers, and the ledger itself, worn brass-bound and heavy. The leather gone soft as cloth at the corners from 40 years of a sailor's hands. She drew it to her across the table. She knew exactly where to open it. She had sat by one candle in the cottage many nights with this book. After the captain died and left her the keeping of his accounts and nothing else, and she had found the page that the great lady had spent 4 years making sure no one would ever read. She turned to it now and laid the ledger flat and weighted it open with her own gloved hand, and the candle threw its gold up into her face, and she read aloud. She read the date first plainly. An October day 3 winters gone. Then she read the captain's own hand, his entry, in the dry exact language of a man who totted up cargo and freight and wages, and never wrote a word he could not stand behind. She read of a loan, not her debts, not the spendthrift wife of the great lady's story, dancing a weak man to his ruin, but a loan called in, a sum advanced by the family to the younger son against his small portion, and then called in suddenly and entire, at a season when no honest man could meet it, by the family's own woman of business under her own hand. She read the figure. It was a cruel figure. She read the captain's note beside it, 4 words underlined once. "This is not right." She read on. She read how the younger son, faced with that ruin, and too weak and too proud to come to his own father, had taken the only ship that would have him, on the worst kind of winter passage, to earn what could not be borrowed and could not be begged, and never came home. And she read the last entry on the page, the captain's own reckoning of who had paid down what could be paid, quietly, in small sums, out of nothing, over 4 bad years, asking no one and telling no one. A column of little payments in a fast, neat hand that was not the captain's. It was hers. He had set down her name beside each one. The hall had gone very quiet again. Not the quiet of a room turning against a woman, the other quiet. "That is the account," Selina said, and shut the ledger and laid her hand flat on the cover. "My father-in-law kept it because he kept everything. He used to say the sea keeps no secret a careful book cannot recover." She lifted her eyes at last, not to Crispin, but to the great lady. He kept this one against the day someone would tell the county I drove his son to his death. I did not. The note was called. I was at the harbour with my father, mending boats, the day it was called. I paid what I could of it after, out of my own widowhood, because it was owed, and because no one else would. That is the whole of my scheming. Mrs. Penhallow's smile was still on her face, but it had stopped being a smile. It sat there, fixed, while the colour went out from under it in increments, the way colour leaves a face slowly, when the heart has gone cold first. Not all at once, but draining, a band at a time, from the well-bred cheek and the thin, practised mouth, until the proud, handsome face above the dove-grey silk was very nearly the grey of the silk itself. "That book," she said, and her voice had lost its beautiful carry, "proves nothing. An old man's scribble. He was failing at the end. Sentiment. Anyone may write a figure in a book." She turned to the room, and the chatelaine chimed at her waist, and for the first time the sound of it was thin. "You will not, surely you will not, take the word of a dead man's ledger over." "There is a letter," said Selina. She had not been sure of the letter she had hoped. The captain had spoken of it once, near the end, his big scarred hands shaking on the chart table, telling her there had been a letter, that he had written the whole of it down plain, the calling of the loan, and the woman who called it, and meant it to go to his elder son at sea, to Crispin, who had a right to know what his family had done, while he was away being made into a lord. And the letter had never come. It had been given into the household to be sent, and it had been intercepted, and it had been lost, in the way that letters are lost when a great lady with a chattercene of keys does not wish them found. "On the table," Selina said, and looked at it, the single old folded letter that had lain all afternoon among the 3 honest objects, unregarded, beside the ledger and the strong box. A letter with a seal that had been broken once and then mended, the wax pressed back and made whole again by a hand that had wanted it to look unopened. That one, with the broken seal. It was Quennell who took it up. The dry grey attorney set down his green-taped bundle on the rostrum and reached across and lifted the folded letter and turned it in his careful hands and looked at the seal a long moment under the candle. The broken then restored seal, the wax that had been forced and then pressed flat and resealed, and had never afterwards sat quite true. The pale, shrewd eyes went to the great lady's chatelaine at her waist, where among the little keys hung a seal, an old family seal, and the eyes came back to the letter, and Selina watched him weigh, in one cool grey instant, the whole long dishonest day against the figure of his own standing, and his own quiet conscience. "This came to my office," Quennell said, to the room in his dust-dry voice that no one had heard speak above a murmur all afternoon. "Among the late captain's effects, I have not opened it. The direction is to his lordship." He paused, and the pause was a precipice. "The seal has been broken before and mended." "Read it," said Crispin. "My lord," the great lady began. "Read it, Quennell." The attorney broke the mended seal, and it gave at once because it had given before. He unfolded the letter and held it to the candle and read it out, and he did not soften it, because he was not a man who softened anything, and because to soften it now would be to perjure himself in front of the whole county, and he had decided, in that one cool instant, that he would not. He read the captain's plain account of the loan and the calling of it. He read the captain's plain naming of who had called it, and why. To keep the shipwright's girl in her place and out of the family's name. To punish the marriage the elder son had wanted and been refused. To manage a weak man and a clever woman, both into the quiet and the debt and the grave. He read the captain's plain words to his elder son. "You were lied to and parted from her, and I could not stop it. Mend it if ever you can. The book has it all." And he read the date. The letter had been written and sealed 2 years before the captain died. It had been broken open within the week. The hall did not turn against Selina now. It turned slowly, the way a great weight turns, toward the tall, erect woman in the dove grey silk who stood at the Lord's elbow with the grey come all the way up into her face and her ringed hand. At the chatelaine of little keys, holding it still, as if to stop it chiming, as if the small chime that the whole county had trusted for 40 years had become a thing that would convict her if it were heard once more. She did not faint, she did not protest. The proud face simply emptied, by degrees in front of them all, into the sunken look of a woman watching a lie she has nursed, for years read back to her, in her own dead brother's hand, and finding that there is no smile in her store that will answer it, and no graciousness and no key. Selina should have felt triumph. She had come for exactly this, and she had it. The room was cleared for her name washed in front of the whole county, in the captain's honest ink, the great lady grey and silenced, the lie undone. She stood with her hand flat on the ledger, and waited for the triumph to come up in her like the flood, and it did not come. Because she had made the mistake at the last of looking at Crispin. He had heard the whole of it. He had stood behind his table while his aunt's letter named, in his dead father's words, every wrong that had been done in his absence and in his name. The parting, the managed marriage, the cold loan, the death, the 4 years of lies he had ridden home and believed. And his weathered grave face had gone past shock now into something far worse. A slow and terrible understanding turned at last not outward on the woman who had lied but inward, on himself, on the man who had been sent to sea and made into a lord, and married her off to his own brother, and come home a year ago to be handed a county's worth of cruelty about her, and had taken it whole, had stood at this table not an hour since presiding over the sale of her father in Law's life, and looking at her veiled across the room as at a stranger. He had believed it too. That was what she saw in his face. The aunt had told the lie, but the Lord had believed it, and had let himself be managed into believing it, because it was easier than fighting his family a second time for a shipwright's daughter. And he knew it, now, in front of everyone, and there was no veil he could throw over that. He opened his mouth. She saw him try. She saw the firm mouth that had been set hard all year work once around her name, and she saw the shame come up and stop it, the unbearable shame of a good man who has just been shown the exact shape of the wrong he allowed, with the woman he wronged standing 3 feet from him in her widow's black and her dead brother's debts. He could not say it. He could not look at her and say it. He turned his face away. Not in coldness, she understood that even then, even with the marsh cold closing in her chest, he turned it away because he could not bear to have her see what was in it. And the turning away was the cruelest thing of the whole cruel day, because she had walked the length of a county's contempt to stand at this table, and at the end of it, the one man she had ever wanted could not meet her eyes. The sale was over. It came apart around them in a low-rising buzz of scandal, benches scraping, the great lady's friends drawing back from her by inches, the stout man at the front already turning to tell the woman beside him what he had seen with his own eyes, the county's belief breaking up and reforming around its new and better story, like the tide round a wreck. Frederica Vane had both gloved hands pressed to her mouth, and her anxious blue eyes were wet, and under the distress, plainly, quietly relieved. Quesnel stood holding the open letter with the broken seal, and watched the room with his careful neutral face and the look of a man who had known, since noon, exactly how the day would end, and was not sorry it had. Selina did not stay for any of it. She drew the ledger to her off the table, and she took up the small brass trunks by its handle, the box of her dead husband's unpaid debts and her father-in-law's honest reckoning, the only things in the whole blazing hall that were truly hers to take. and she did not ask leave, and no one moved to stop her. She did not look again at the grey emptied face of the great lady. She let herself look, once, at Crispin's turned-away head, the dark hair, and the braced set of the shoulders that carried his new consequence, like a coat that did not fit. And she let it cost her what it cost, and then she put it down inside her, with the other things she had learned to carry and take up no room. She reached up and drew the black veil down over her face again, and the candlelight went grey behind it, and she walked back down the long hall, through the rich half-mourning silks and the turning faces, out of the warmth and the firelight and the brass and the gilt, with the lurcher pressed grey against her black hem, and the ledger under her arm, and the strong-box in her hand. The great oak doors were open on the night. She went out through them into the cold, off the lamplit gravel of the forecourt, and onto the dark heath above the dunes, where the wind came up off the marsh smelling of salt and frost, and the cold North Sea lay out, beyond the saltings, a thin line of starlit silver, and the warm-lit windows of Wraxham Hall threw their long gold bars out across the grass behind her, and did not reach her. She had won. She had stood up in the great lady's own hall, and read the truth out of the captain's honest book, and turned a whole county round in an afternoon, and her name was clean now where it had been black, and the lie that had ridden her for 4 years lay dead on the auctioneer's table behind her in her dead father-in-law's ink, and she was walking out into the freezing dark alone, with a box of debts and a dog, and the only man she had ever loved had not been able to look at her face. The cold came up off the marsh to meet her, clean and indifferent. Somewhere out on the black saltings the tide was going out, the water running down off the mud and away to the sea, leaving the creek a grey thread, and the Staithe high and dry and empty in the dark. Pilot pressed close against her knee, as the heath gave way to the marsh path, and she put one gloved hand down to his rough grey head, and kept walking, away from the lights, down toward the harbour, and the one cold candle, and the long winter that was coming on. Behind her the hall blazed warm in the dark and let her go. The frost would be hard by morning. She could feel it already in the air, in the way the stars stood sharp and close over the open marsh, and she pulled her widow's blacks about her against it, and went down toward the water, and did not once look back. The creek ran black and full at the turn of the year, and the Staithe that had once held 2 clever heads bent over a dropped chart stood empty under a sky the colour of a drawn sword. Selina walked it most mornings, because she had nowhere else that was hers, and because Pilot would not settle, until she did. The tide came up fast in winter, brown and cold and chivied by the wind, slapping at the worn bollards, snatching the coiled rope to a dripping rigidity. Where the summer had laid bright water against the planking, and a softness of sea lavender along the marsh, now there was only the scoured timber, the grey mud sucking and ticking as it drained, and the long black saltings stiff with frost. She kept her hands in the worn black spencer, and counted nothing, because there was nothing left to count. The county had her name now, and it had it the right way at last. Quesnel had seen to the bare bones of that. A dry paragraph in the right ears, the old captain's hand quoted, "The lie unpicked." People who had cut her in the lane before the auction now stepped aside, with a careful courtesy that was worse than the cut. They knew. They had believed the other thing for 4 years, easily, comfortably, and now they were obliged to believe this, and they could not look at her while they did it. She did not blame them, and she did not thank them. She had the truth of herself back, which was a great deal, and she had less money than she had ever had in her life, which was the rest of it. Twice that month a Marwood manservant had come down the lane to the harbour cottage with a sealed note, and the second time a small heavy purse, and twice she had sent both back unopened up the heath to Wraxham Hall. She knew what charity from that house would say of her. Even now, even cleared, it would say she had bid and unveiled and shamed a great lady before the county for this. For a purse and a pension, and the titles grudging keep, she would sooner starve clean. She told herself this by one candle at the sloped table, ruling the captain's books over again from habit, the columns running true under her fast neat hand, and adding, every night, to the same small bitter sum, cleared in name, poorer than ever. She had won, and she had kept her pride, and the two of them sat on the cold hearth together and gave off no heat at all. Up on the heath the great house had gone dark in its own way. The auction had collapsed in the worst scandal the county had known in a generation, and a sale stopped in scandal is not a sale undone, but a wound left open. The lots stood half-catalogued in the cold great hall, the labels curling, the carved oak screen throwing long shadows where the candle-stands had been carried away. Crispin had let the fires die back to one in the small estate office and worked there, alone, day on grey day, with the captain's ledger open before him and the old folded letter beside it, its broken, then restored seal turned up to the lamp. He had read the ledger so many times he could have ruled its columns blind. He no longer read it for the figures. He read it for the man behind the figures, his father, dead and honest, writing down quietly across years what the family was doing and what it cost, the forced loan, the concealed debt, the slow squeezing of the younger son, toward the one desperate voyage that would clear it or drown him, and the drowning. And on the facing page, in a different ink smaller, the careful entries of a daughter-in-law nobody had thanked, a wage saved here, a chandler's bill quietly met there, a debt paid down by a woman with a sharp head for figures and no name to spend. Tobias had set the two records side by side on purpose, the wrong and the mending of it, so that any man who ever opened the book would see them together. Crispin saw them together now. He saw a great deal that he had not let himself see for 4 years, and the seeing did not flatter him. There was one entry he came back to, more than the rest, dated the autumn the younger brother sailed his last voyage. His father had ruled it twice, as Tobias did when a thing was to be marked, and set against it the sum the family had called in that season. The loan made a noose. The note demanded, at the one moment the younger son could not meet it without going to sea in a bad ship, in a bad month. Crispin had been at the far end of the Baltic when it was done. He had known nothing of it. But a man could not read his own father's hand recording the thing, and go on thinking himself clean of it, merely because he had been absent. Absence had been his whole part in this, the thing he had let stand in for refusal twice over. He shut the ledger on that page some nights, and could not bear it open, and opened it again because the not-bearing was a luxury he had not earned. He had been managed. He could put no kinder word to it, and he had stopped trying. 4 years ago, he had stood on that bright stave, with a shipwright's clever daughter and known, with the whole certainty of a young man's blood, that here was his match, quick and equal, the two of them reading each other across a dropped sea chart like a fair wind. And the family had looked at her plain Norfolk people and her clever, frightening head, and decided she would not do for the air. And they had sent him away to sea, with his duty rolled up like orders, and married her to the younger brother instead, to keep her managed and near and safe. He had let it be done. He had been young and overgoverned, and he had told himself it was honour. He saw now that it had been obedience, which is a smaller thing wearing honour's coat. And then they had told him the lie, and he had let that be done too. Augusta had built it brick by brick, a word at a dinner, a sigh in a drawing-room, the schemer who married for the name and drove the boy to his death. And Crispin, far off, sick at the loss of her, half wanting to believe, the woman he could not have was unworthy of the wanting, had taken the lie like a draught and slept on it for 4 years. He had come home to a title he never asked for, and a sale he hated, and a convenient match chosen for him, and he had stood at the auctioneer's table and presided over the stripping of his own father's life, and he had not once doubted the story his family had fed him, until a veiled widow raised a black-gloved hand at the back of the hall and gave a figure in a low, exact voice that stopped his heart. He had recognized the voice before he recognized her. That was the thing he could not get past. Before the veil came back, before the white shock, before any of it, some honest part of him had known her from the shape of a number spoken aloud, and had leapt, and had been glad. And then the rest of him had remembered the lie and made him sit still while his sister named the woman he loved a murderess to the whole county. He had sat still. He had been ashamed and white and silent at his own table while she stood alone and read out his father's hand to clear herself, and then she had taken the ledger and the strong box he came for and walked out into the cold, and he had let her go a second time, twice. He had let her be parted from him twice, once by duty and once by doubt, and both times he had called his silence by some better name. The ledger lay open under the lamp, and would not let him do it a third time, though it had nothing to tell him about how to mend it, and neither did the empty house. Augusta kept to her rooms. She had not appeared at table since the day of the sale. He had gone up once, stiffly, meaning to have it out and finding he could not, and had seen only a tall spare woman, sitting very upright in a cold chamber with her hands in her lap, and the small chiming chatelaine of keys and seals laid aside on the table where she could not reach it without rising. Her colour had not come back. The proud, handsome face had gone the grey of her own silk and stayed there, sunk, the eyes fixed on nothing. A woman watching a lie she had nursed for years, read back to her in her own dead brother's hand, and unable to stop seeing it. He had thought he would feel some triumph. He felt none. He felt only the cold of a house where everyone had been wrong and no one could undo it, and went back down to the office and the lamp and the book. It was Frederica Vane who said the thing aloud that he had not let himself say. She came on a hard, bright afternoon in February, when the frost had held 3 days, and the marsh lay white to the silver line of the sea. And she came on purpose and alone but for her maid, which for Frederica was an act of considerable courage. He received her in the cold drawing-room with the one fire, and she sat with her hands folded over a great deal of expensive lace, and her round, soft face anxious, and for a while they spoke of the weather and the roads in the careful way of two people who have been moved on a board against their wills and have only just understood it. Then she stopped and looked at her hands and said, "My lord, I am going to say something forward, and I beg you will let me, because I have been frightened to come, and I shall lose my nerve if I am polite much longer." "Say it," he said. "I do not wish to marry you." She said it gently, kindly, and went on quickly before his face could change. "That is, I think you are a good man, and you have been very correct with me. More than I deserved, when I know your heart has been somewhere else this whole winter. I have known it since the auction. I saw you watching her before any of us knew who she was, and I saw your face when the veil came back. And, my lord, no woman wishes to be the one a man marries, because his family chose her while he was looking at someone across the room." Her anxious blue eyes came up to his, and there was a real and unmistakable relief shining under the fright. "I never wanted it either. My people wanted it. I am not brave enough to have stopped it on my own. But after what I saw, and what the whole county now knows of how she was wronged, I cannot pretend, and I will not be married out of duty to a man who has done enough out of duty already. So I release you. There is no understanding between us, and there never was anything but 2 families arithmetic, and I am very glad to have it off my conscience." He found, when he tried to thank her, that his voice was not steady, and she saw it, and was kind about that too. Go to her, Frederica said simply, gathering her gloves, the worst said and her courage spent, and her relief plain as morning. Whatever stands between you, go and stand in front of it. You have let other people part you twice. Don't let your own pride do it a third time. He had nothing to give her in return but the truth, which she had earned, and so he gave it. That she was right, that his heart had been across the room and not at his own table, that she deserved a man who had chosen her, and not merely failed to refuse her, and that he was sorry to have let his family make her one more figure in their arithmetic. She heard it with her round, soft face quite steady for once, and nodded, and seemed lighter for being told plainly the thing she had been brave enough to say first. He saw her to her carriage and stood on the cold gravel while it went down the drive toward the White Marsh, and the last convenient obstacle went with it, and he was free. Free of the match, free of the lie, free of every false thing that had been laid between himself and Selina Marwood. And he was certain, with the whole weight of the winter behind it, that it was too late. She had sent back 2 purses unopened. She had walked out of his father's house with her chin level and never once looked back at him. A woman cleared at such cost, betrayed by his silence in front of the county, did not forgive the man who had sat still and watched. He had no right to her forgiveness, and he knew it, and knowing it kept him at the hall through the worst of the frost, turning the ledger's pages, and getting no nearer the only thing he wanted. Down at the harbour the worst of the winter came for Selina in earnest. The frost broke into a long wet cold that got into the cottage stone and into her chest, and there was no money for more than the one fire, and not always for that, and she had let the last of her credit at the chandler's go, rather than take a Marwood penny, and she grew thin and grey-lipped and very quiet. Pilot would not leave the hearth. The lurcher lay across her feet through the long evenings, with his grey muzzle on his paws and his eyes open, and when she coughed he lifted his head and watched her until she was still again. She ruled the captain's books out of habit, and then could not always see the columns by one candle, and put the pencil down, and sat with her hands open in her lap, in a way that would have frightened her had she seen it, because it was the way Augusta Penhallow sat in her cold room up on the heath, 2 ruined women a marsh apart, each undone by the same truth. A coasting brig lay in the creek that February waiting on a fair wind for the Tyne and the north, and her master was an old friend of Tobias Marwood's, and he had let it be known, gently in the way of harbour men, that there would be a passage for the captain's daughter-in-law, if she wanted it, cheap or for nothing, away from Norfolk and the Marwoods, and the whole cold tangle of it, to begin again somewhere that had never heard her name spoken either way. She thought about it more than she would have admitted to go. To let the tide that had taken her husband and her father-in-law take her too, north and clean away, and never again walk a stave where a tall, dark man had once bent his head over a chart beside hers. She had won her name and lost everything else. Perhaps the thing to do with a one name was carry it somewhere it could earn bread. The cough settled into her chest and would not be shifted, and there were nights she lay listening to her own breathing in the dark cottage and thought, without much fear, that a body could go out as quietly as a candle, if it were left alone long enough and cold enough. She kept the fire when she could, and let it go when she could not, and she did not send for the surgeon at Wells, because the surgeon would have to be paid, and there was nothing to pay him with. That was not a Marwood penny in disguise. Pilot brought her things in those days: a dropped glove, a stick from the saltings, once a dead and frozen sandpiper laid solemnly on the hearth. Small useless tribute, the way a creature gives what it has to a person it has decided to keep. And she thanked him for each one in a cracked voice, and was, on the worst nights, more glad of the warm grey weight of him across her feet than she would ever have said aloud. She took the ship's bell button out from under her bodice one bad night and held it in her palm by the one candle. It was a small brass thing, cut from the coat of the quieter, weaker man she had been married to keep her managed. And she had worn it 4 years not out of love, for there had been no love in that grey small wedding, but out of a stubborn honest grief for a man who had been failed by his own family, quite as badly as she had. She turned it in the light. On the table the captain's ledger lay open at the marked page, the wrong and the mending side by side in 2 inks, and she looked from the button to the book and asked herself, plainly, the way she added a column, whether the truth had been worth the cost. She had paid for it with her good name made public, with her last credit, with her health, with the man she had loved before any of this, watching her in silence while she fought alone. She had bought, with all of that, 3 honest objects and the bare fact of being believed. It was a poor exchange by any reckoning her father had taught her, and yet she sat very still with the button in one hand and the lamp making a small gold room of the cold cottage. Pilot's weight warm across her feet, and yet a false account left standing was a thing the sea kept forever, and a true one, however dearly bought, came back on the tide. The captain had taught her that. A woman who can read a true account is never quite at the mercy of the men who keep a false one. She had read the true account aloud to the whole county. Whatever else the cost had bought, it had bought her out of their power, and there was no price too high for that, and she would not be sorry. And she would not take the brig, and she would not, by God, take a Marwood purse. She put the button back on its worn cord under her bodice, and blew out the candle, and sat in the dark with the dog, and did not weep, which was its own small victory, and the tide came up the creek outside, and turned and went down again, and it was the lowest she came, and she came up off it by herself, which was the only way she had ever come up off anything. It was 3 days after that, in a thin clearing afternoon, with the wind dropped and the creek beginning to fill, that the knock came at the cottage door. She thought it was the chandler's boy, and went with her shawl pulled close, and opened it, and stood quite still. Crispin Marwood stood in the lane, with the grey marsh light behind him, and no horse, no carriage, no servant. He had come on foot down the heath and across the saltings, 4 cold miles, and there was salt mud to the knee of his plain dark coat, and the wind had reddened his weathered face, and he carried nothing, no purse, no sealed note from the family, none of the things she had sent back. He had no consequence about him at all. He stood at her door like a man who had walked a long way to say something, and was not sure he would be let to say it. Pilot came past her skirts and looked up at him, and did not bark, which she noticed. "I'm not come from the family," Crispin said. His voice was low and uneven, none of the grave remote master of the sail left in it. "I'm not come with money. You sent the money back twice, and you were right to. I haven't anything to offer you that you'd be obliged to take, and I've no right to stand here, and I know it. I've come to give you 2 things that are yours, and then I'll go if you tell me to." She did not ask him in. She stood in the doorway with the cold coming past her into the cottage and waited, her chin level, her face giving nothing away, the cool flush climbing one cheekbone the only sign that she was anything but stone. He took from his coat a small key, a plain old brass key, worn bright at the bow, and held it out across the threshold on his open palm. "The key to the strong box," he said. "It was never the family's to keep. My father's books, his strong box, the truth in them, they're yours, everyone by right of who kept them honest, and that was never any of us but him and you. I had Quennell draw it up plain, so no one can ever say otherwise. The box is cleared, the debts discharged out of the estate, proper in the open, with the county knowing why, not as charity, as restitution, Because you paid down what was owed for years, and were never owned to have done it. The key's yours. I should have brought it the same night, and instead I sat at that table and let my sister. He stopped. He did not finish the excuse, because it was an excuse, and he had promised himself he would not make any. That's one thing, she said. Her voice was very quiet and very even. You said too. The other's an accounting. He drew it out then, the second thing, not a purse, a folded paper, several sheets, close written in his own hand, and she saw that he had ruled it. He had ruled it like a ledger, the way her father had taught the whole family to set down a true reckoning, debits and credits, dates and sums. And she understood before she read a word of it that he had sat alone in that cold house and totted up his own wrong against her, the only honest way. He knew. Every wrong I let be done to you, he said, the first time and the second. I've set it all down, plain, dated, in order, the way he'd have wanted it kept, so that there's a true account of it somewhere. Even if you never speak to me again, the parting 4 years ago, I let them send me to sea, rather than stand on that stave and say I would have you and no other. That's the first entry, and it's mine, not theirs, because a man grown can refuse to be sent, and I didn't. And the day of the sale, you stood in my father's hall and read out his hand to save your own name in front of the whole county, alone, and I sat at the table and said nothing, and let you walk out into the dark, and that's the last entry, and it's the worst of them, and it's mine too. He held the ruled sheets out beside the key, both hands open across her doorstep, offering, I'm not asking you to forgive it. I haven't balanced it. I don't think it balances. I came to give you the truth of it written down where you can read it, because you taught me, he taught us all, and you most of all, that a true account is owed even when it can't be paid. That's all. The key, and the reckoning, and an apology that isn't worth the paper but is true. Take them and shut the door and I'll go. The wind had dropped right away. Out beyond the cottage the creek was filling, the brown water creeping back up the grey mud channel by channel, a clean line of it advancing on the turn, and the gulls had gone quiet, and there was a thin, low amber light coming under the cloud from the west, across the white marsh, the first the day had given. Pilot had sat down on the threshold between them, leaning his grey-muzzled weight against Crispin's mud-stained boot, as though he had decided something the two of them had not yet dared to. Selina looked at the key in one of his open hands and the ruled sheets in the other, the two honest things held out to her across her own doorstep by a man who had walked 4 cold miles to bring her not money but the truth, and she did not take them, and she did not shut the door. You'd better come out of the wind, she said at last, very low, while I read it. And she stood back from the doorway to let him in, and behind him, on the creek, the tide came on up the channel, clear and rising, turning at last toward the full. The thaw came late and all at once. For weeks the creek had run black and full under a low scoured sky, the saltings bare, the stave empty of everything but wind. Then one grey dawn the wind dropped, and Selina, walking out from the cottage with Pilot loose at her heel, found the marsh changed under her feet. The frost had let go of the ground. Sea lavender, that had been black stick since November, showed a faint flush of green low among the samphire, and the tide was coming in. She stood on the little brick-arched footbridge and watched it come. Not the choked black flood of the winter, but the old clean flood she remembered, sea silver sliding up the grey mud, filling the channel rope by rope, lifting the weed off the bollards, drowning the dark line of the ebb until the whole reach below the stave ran bright and high and level with the morning. The light on it was new. After months of slate and iron, there was a thin warm gold in the east, the first proper light of the year, and it lay along the water, and along the timber of the stave, and along the wet rail of the bridge under her ungloved hand. She had not put on the gloves. That was a small thing, and she noticed it as a small thing. Her hands lay bare on the bridge rail, in the cold spring air, the thin gold band on the right one catching the light. She had walked out without the veil too. It hung on its peg by the cottage door, where she had left it the night he came. He came onto the Staithe from the town side, on foot, hatless, the way he had come 3 nights before, not as a lord, with no horse and no man and no consequence about him at all. Only a tall dark Ferke walking the worn timber toward the bridge with the new sun in his face. He stopped at the foot of it. The bridge was narrow. To come up onto it, he would have to come within reach of her, and he knew it, and he waited at the foot with one hand on the brick of the arch and looked up at her standing in the gold. "You came back," she said. "You let me," he said. "3 nights ago you might have shut the door. You didn't shut it." I was tired of shut doors. She had not meant to begin so plainly, but the winter had worn the politeness off her, the way it wore the paint off the Staithe, down to the grain, and what was left was only the true thing. "Come up then, if you're coming. I'm not going to talk to you from a height." We did enough of that, the pair of us, with you at the top of a room and me at the back of it. He came up onto the bridge. Pilate lifted his grey muzzle, looked at the man, and put it down again on his paws, which from Pilate was a benediction. Crispin stood a careful arm's length from her at the rail, and the two of them looked out at the tide, instead of at each other. Because it was easier, and because this was the place, and they both knew it was the place. "We met here," he said, "on this bridge, 4 years gone near enough." Her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "You dropped a chart over the side, and I caught it before the water did, and you looked at me as though a girl off the Staithe had no business knowing which way up a chart went." "I did not look at you so." "You did, for about as long as it takes to read a tide table. Then you looked at me another way." She turned the gold band on her finger with her thumb, around and around, a thing she did when she was holding herself level. "I've thought about that other way a great deal this winter. I had a long time to think. I want to understand it before I let it mean anything again, because I will not be managed twice into a thing I didn't choose, not even into this. So you'll account to me, Crispin, here, where it started, both times, the leaving and the doubting. Plainly, with nothing left out, the way the captain taught me to read a column, every figure or none." He was quiet a moment. A curlew went over, bubbling, away toward the open water, and the tide pushed another foot up the channel below them. "Ask," he said the first time. She kept her eyes on the water. "4 years ago, you loved me, you said so, on this bridge, and in the boat shed, and once in the churchyard, like a fool, with your father's whole crew within hailing. And then you were gone to sea inside a month, and inside 3, I was being walked up the aisle to your brother, in a grey gown with your aunt's hand, at my elbow like a jailer's. I want to know what you did in that month to stop it. Not what was done to you, what you did." It was the hardest question, and she put it first on purpose. She watched the side of his face take it. "Less than I have told myself I did," he said. "That is the true answer, and I have only this winter let myself say it. I told my father I meant to have you. I said it loud, and I said it more than once, and I thought, because I had never in my life been refused a thing I truly wanted, that saying it loud would be enough. And my aunt," he stopped and made himself go on. "Augusta took me aside and was very gentle and very reasonable, and she put it to me that a man who loved a girl off the Staithe would ruin her by marrying her, that the county would never have you, that my father's name would be a millstone round your neck, and you'd be miserable in a great cold house among people who'd cut you, and that the kind thing, the manful thing, was to go away to sea and let the heat pass, and let her be settled near us where she'd be safe and respected. She made my walking away sound like the gift I gave you." His jaw set. And I was 24 and full of myself, and she gave me a way to feel noble while I did the cowardly thing, and I took it. I went. That is what I did. I let a clever woman dress my running as a sacrifice, and I ran. And the marriage, to your brother. I did not know of it until it was done. I was off the dogger in a blow when they married you. That is the truth, and it is also no excuse, because I had left the field clear for them, and they did what such people do with a clear field. He turned then, away from the water, to look at her. I have asked myself 100 nights this winter whether, if I had stayed, I could have stopped it. And the honest answer is I don't know, but I never found out, because I did not stay. So you may lay that at my door, Selina, and I'll not move out from under it. She let that sit, the light climbed. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed him. Not because the answer flattered her, but because it didn't. The second time then, she said. The doubting. That's the one I can't carry so easy, Crispin. Because the first time you were a green boy, and I'll grant a green boy his folly. But the second time you were a man grown and lately come home, and you stood in that hall by her elbow, and let her tell the whole county that I'd married your brother for the name, and hounded him to his death.
And you believed it.
You believed it of me. For a year you believed it. And you'd have married that frightened child, Frederica, believing it. And you never once came to the cottage to ask the woman herself whether the thing the family said was true. That's the figure I can't make balance. You loved me once on this bridge. How does a man go from that to believing I drove a man into the sea? Because I wanted to, he said. She had not expected that. She looked at him fully for the first time, since he'd come up onto the bridge. It is the ugliest true thing I have to tell you, so I'll tell it first and plainest. His voice was low and steady, and he did not spare himself. When I came home and found you a widow, my brother's widow, and found I still wanted you, the way I'd wanted you at 24, only worse, because now there was grief and guilt all bound up in it. It was unbearable to me, Selina, to want my dead brother's wife. So when Augusta came to me, gentle and reasonable as ever, and told me you were a schemer who'd ruined him, I seized it. Do you understand? She handed me a reason to hate what I wanted, and hating it was easier than wanting it, so I believed her, because the lie let me off. The lie meant I needn't feel what I felt. I let her make you wicked so that I could stop loving you in peace. That is the whole of it, and there is no part of it I'm proud of. The tide had reached the full now. It stood level and bright below them, neither making nor ebbing, the still, slack water of high water, the marsh held in it like a thing in a glass. That's an honest accounting, she said at last, and her voice was not quite steady, and she let it not be. It's an ugly one, and I'm glad of it. A pretty one I'd not have trusted. She looked down at the bright water. I'll tell you my side of that figure since we're balancing. I didn't drive your brother anywhere, but I didn't love him either, and I knew on my wedding morning that I was marrying the wrong Marwood, and I went through with it because your aunt had told me the same kind tale she told you. That it was the safe thing, the respectable thing, that a shipwright's girl who reached above herself would be punished for it. That the younger son would be a quiet harbour for me. We were both managed with the same gentleness, Crispin, by the same hand, told the same that running was kindness. So I'll not stand here the pure wronged woman, and you the only sinner. I let Miss myself settled too. I was tired and I was poor, and I let it be done. You were 23, and they'd taken from you the man you wanted, he said. I'll not have you balance that against what I did. I'll balance what I please, she said, with the first edge of the old spark, and saw it land on him, saw something in his grave face lighten by a hair. I have the better head for figures. You'll let me keep the books. They stood. The slack water held. Somewhere up the Staithe a halyard knocked against a mast, and a gull came down white onto a bollard and considered them. "There's the rest of it to read," she said more gently. "Before we say what this is, you'll want it read whole, and so do I. Walk back with me. It's all on the captain's table in the cottage where I keep it, and I'll not have it kept in the dark any longer, the way she kept it." She whistled low and Pilate rose. "Come and see the books, my lord, then we'll know where we stand." He had brought, that night 3 nights gone, the strong box key, and a plain accounting in his own hand, and the key now turned the lock it had been made for. They sat at the captain's sloped table in the cottage, by the cold hearth, Pilate flat on the brick between them, and they read the honest things, through one last time, not as weapons now, the way they'd been read across the blazing hall, but slowly, the two of them shoulder to shoulder, over the worn brass-bound spine, the way she imagined the old man had meant them to be read. She opened the ledger to the marked page, and they went down it together. The captain's own hand, brown ink gone faint, every figure ruled and tottered and signed, the forced loan dated and set down, that Augusta had pressed on the younger son in the family's name, and at the family's rate, to cover a family debt that was never his. And the second loan to cover the first, and the freight he'd taken to cover that, the desperate last freight on a bad ship in a bad season, because the alternative was to go to his sister and be managed worse. And below it, in a smaller, neater, faster hand that was not the captain's at all, the quiet payments, some Selina had put against the debt out of nothing, out of her own widow's pittance, week by week, the figures of a woman trying to bail a sinking thing with a thimble. "You paid down his debts," Crispin said. "All that winter you let the county believe you'd beggared him. And you were paying down his debts in secret out of your own want, and you never said. Who would I have said it to?" She turned the page. "You? You'd decided I was wicked. Her? She'd have called it cunning." The captain knew. "He sat where you're sitting, and he watched me do it, and he wrote it down in his own hand under his son's, so that one day a careful book could recover what a false tongue had buried. The sea keeps no secret," he used to say, "that a careful book cannot bring up off the bottom." He kept the careful book. I only added the figures he couldn't reach. Beside the ledger lay the letter, the old folded letter, its broken seal mended now with fresh wax pressed over the cracked print of the captain's own ring, the letter Augusta had once intercepted and lost, and that Quesnel, dry and grey and unwilling to perjure his soul, had produced at the last. They read it again. It named the lie outright in the captain's words, written to his elder son at sea and never delivered, that the girl was good, that she had been wronged, that the family had used her ill and meant to use her worse, and that if Crispin had any of his father in him, he would come home and undo it before it was past undoing. 4 years too late it had reached the man it was written to, but it had reached him. "He told me to come home," Crispin said, very low, his finger under the line. 4 years ago he told me to come home and undo it, if she had let this letter pass. She didn't, Selina said. So we don't get to know that house we'd have had. We only get this one. She closed the ledger with care, both hands flat on the worn brass corners, the way the captain sat in his one dark portrait over the hearth. "It's done its work, the book. It's cleared me in the county." Quesnel saw to that. He'd not let a false thing stand. Once a true one was opened, he read the loan into the record before the magistrates, and the worst of the talk died. Inside a fortnight. And it's broken her. For Augusta Penhallow it had broken the way the Bible's careful eye had foretold, and the county had watched, in a kind of hush, not in noise but in increments. The gracious smile had fixed and then failed. The colour had drained from the long, well-bred face the grey of her own silk. The chatelaine of little keys and seals at her waist had stopped chiming because she had stopped moving among people. She had withdrawn to 2 rooms at the far end of the hall. and was seen no more in the county that had been hers. And 3 days since, before he had walked to the cottage, she had sent for Crispin, and made what small restitution a proud broken woman can. Not love, for she had none to give, and not the years back, for no one had those. But the deed of the harbour cottage and its 2 acres of saltings, signed over to Selina Marwood absolutely, free of all claim, with a single line under it in the high exact hand the camera had learned to mistrust. It was mine to give, and I withheld it. It was always hers. It was as near to I lied as such a woman would ever come, and Selina, reading it, had felt no triumph, only a cold, clean closing, like a door shutting on an empty room. "She'll not say more than that," Selina said. "And I'll not ask it. I've the cottage and my name and the truth on the record. That's restitution enough out of a stone. I'd not squeeze her for tears she hasn't got. You're a great deal more merciful than I'd be. I'm a great deal more practical. Tears don't enter in the ledger." She rose and went to the cottage door, and lifted the black veil down off its peg, and stood a moment with it loose over her 2 bare hands. The long crape that had hidden her whole face at the back of the blazing hall, that she had thrown back across the room into white shock and a turning county. She looked at it, then she folded it once, and laid it in the captain's empty sea chest with the jet drops and the rubbed grey gloves, and shut the lid. "I've worn black 4 years," she said, turning. "2 for grief I didn't rightly feel, and 2 for armour I did need. I'm done with both. There's a band of dove grey silk in that Press Your Aunt would know the cut of, and I mean to wear it, and the band's as far as I go. Because I'll mourn the man honestly, for the harbour he'd have liked to have been to me, but I'll not go veiled into the rest of my life, for a marriage neither of us chose." She had moved the wedding band too. He saw it now, as she crossed the small room into the thin gold light of the one window. The ring no longer on the proper hand but on the right, worn off to one side, a record kept and set apart, rather than a claim still made, and he saw her whole face in that light with nothing over it, no veil, no black, the contained economy of her gone soft at last, the high cool flush climbing one cheekbone the way it did when she felt the most and showed the least, and her steady grey eyes on him, level and unafraid, waiting. "So," she said, "we've read the books, we've balanced the column, ran the first time and you doubted the second, and you've owned both like a man and not a boy, and you came here on your own feet, with a key and an apology, and not a penny of charity, which is the one coin I'd have thrown back in your face. The figures balance, Crispin. I've checked them twice. There's nothing left owing on either side that an honest account can't close." Her voice caught, just once, and she let it, and went on through it. "I loved you on that bridge 4 years ago, and I never once stopped. Not through the grey wedding, nor the cold marriage, nor the whole long winter,
When you believed me wicked.
I only locked it in the strongbox with everything else I couldn't pay for, and you've brought the key. So if you've come to say the thing, say it plain, the way we've said everything else in this room. I'll not have it managed, and I'll not have it pretty. Say it plain or go home." He crossed the room and he said it plain. He took her bare hands in both of his and bent his weathered grave face down to her, lifted one in the low, gold light off the marsh, and he said, "I want you. Not safe and not settled and not at a respectable distance, here, in this cottage, with a clever woman who keeps better books than I do, for the rest of the life I nearly threw away twice. I should have said it on this bridge 4 years ago, and I'm saying it now. Marry me, Selina, freely, chosen, by neither of us managed into anything ever again." "Plain enough," she said, and her whole lit face came up to his, and the long pull of 4 years and 1 black winter, resolved at last not into anything arranged, into the embrace freely chosen, her bare hands going up into his hair, his arms hard around the straight, contained back that had taken up so little. Room for so long, the dove-grey mornings standing in the one small window, and the cold hearth and the captain, watching from his dark oval and pilot, thumping his tail once on the brick. The high colour and the held stillness and the careful economy of her, all let go together at once. The way the frost had let go of the marsh that morning, all at once and overdue. And she kissed him in the cottage where she had ruled her secret figures by one candle. And there was nothing secret left to rule. They were married that spring in the squat round-towered church above the marsh, very quietly, with Quenelle dry and approving in his snuff-brown, and the whole truth long since read into the county's record, so that the faces in the pews were not the cutting faces the family had once promised her, but only the ordinary ones, curious and warmed, and a little ashamed of what they had believed. Augusta did not come, and was not asked, and sent in her stead the family pearl and one line. "Wear it. You earned the name I said you'd stolen." And Selina wore it, once, and then put it by, because she had never wanted the name and did not begin to now. She had only ever wanted the man and the bridge and a true book to keep. The strong box was cleared by midsummer. They sat over it together at the captain's sloped table, the new Lady Wraxham with her brass-bound notebook and her stub of pencil and her fast, neat hand, the lord beside her, finding he had a head for figures himself, once a clever woman would let him use it, and they went through the whole tangle the family had left. The loans and the freights and the concealed debts, all the false reckoning Augusta's gentle management had nursed in the dark for a generation, and they set it straight, figure by figure, and signed the last page clear. Her gift for numbers that she had hidden all her life, because clever women frighten money, was no longer hidden and no longer frightened anyone, least of all the man who had married it on purpose. They would keep the Marwood books together. After that, honestly, two clever equals at one table, and the estate that had been turned out in lots to be picked over by the county was drawn slowly back together and made to pay its own way and shelter its own people, which the captain would have liked. But that was summer's work and slow. The morning it truly turned, the morning the figures balanced on the bridge, they walked back out onto the Staithe, with the dove-grey light over everything. And the tide at the very full, the creek running clear and high and level with the green-flushed marsh, sea-silver under a low, warm sun. They went up onto the little brick-arched footbridge, where 4 years gone a girl had caught a falling chart out of the air, and they stood on it together, his arm along her, straight back, and her bare hand on the wet rail, and the gold band set off to one side, and below them the bright water lay at the full, and did not ebb, and beyond the Staithe and the Saltings and the long bar the open sea light stood, off clear to the edge of the world. Pilot trotted out ahead of them onto the bright bridge, and stopped at the crown of the arch, grey muzzle lifted into the salt wind, white chest to the sun, looking out the way the water ran. The tide was at the full and holding, and it carried the light up off the open sea and laid it along the timber and the brick, and the two faces turned to it, a record kept, and a wrong mended, carrying the both of them across, at last, to the bright water and the morning.